Chapter 30. One Shall Be Taken. Part 1. Pat was to have stayed 2 weeks at the Bayshore farm. She did not mind much. She had learned how to get along with the aunts, and they thought her much improved. A good bit of Selby in her, after all. The great aunt had passed away a year ago, but nothing else had changed at the Bayshore. Pat liked this. It gave her a nice sensation of having cheated time. But at the end of a week, Long Alec came for her one evening, and his face. "Dad, is anything wrong? Mother—" No, not Mother. Betts. Betts had flu pneumonia. Pat felt an icy finger just touch, her heart. "Why wasn't I sent for before?" she said very quietly. "They didn't think she was in any danger until this evening. She asked for you. I think we'll be in time." Betts, in danger, in time. The phrases made a meaningless jumble in Pat's head. The drive home was like a nightmare. Nothing was real. It couldn't be real. Things like this simply didn't happen. God wouldn't let them. Of course, she would waken soon. Meanwhile, one must keep very quiet. If one said a word too much, one might have to go on dreaming. She had such a queer feeling that her heart was a stone, sinking, 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 ever since that finger had touched it. They drove up to Silver Bush. Pat would go up the hill path. It was quicker so because the lane of the long house ran to Silverbridge Road. Judy caught Pat in her arms as she stumbled from the car. "Judy, Betts—" But no, one must be quiet. One mustn't ask questions. One dared not. "I'll walk up the hill with you, Pat." It was Hilary, a pale, set-lipped Hilary. "Judy," wise Judy whispered to him, "No, let her be going alone, Jingle. It'll be kinder." "Don't you think there's a little hope, Judy?" asked Hilary huskily. Judy shook her head. "I do be getting the sign, Jingle. It's a bit hard to understand. Everyone loved her so. Sure, and heaven must be needing some laughter." Pat didn't know whether she was alone or not. She ran breathlessly along the whispering lane, and down the field and up the hill. The watching pine watched. What was it watching for? A grim red sun with a black bar of clouds across it was setting behind a dark hill as she reached the green gate. She turned for a moment, just a moment before one had to know. As long as one didn't know, one could live. The black sea of a cold, gray April twilight was far below her. That far-away bell was still ringing. It was only a week since she and Betts had listened to it and made their plans for the summer. A thing like this couldn't come in a week. It would need years and years. How foolish she was to be afraid. One must waken soon. May Binney was in the Longhouse kitchen when Pat went in. Always pushing herself in where she wasn't wanted, Pat reflected detachedly. Then the room where she and Betts had slept and whispered and laughed. And Betts, lying on the bed, pale and sweet, always sweet, breathing too quickly. There were others there, Mr. and Mrs. Wilcox, the nurse, but Pat only saw Betts. "Dearest Pat, I'm so glad you've come," Betts whispered. "Darling, how are you?" "Better, Pat, much better, only a little tired." Of course she was better. One had known she must be. Why, then, didn't one waken? Someone put a chair by the bed for Pat, and she sat down. Betts put out a cold hand. How very thin it had grown, and Pat took it. The nurse came up with a hypodermic. Betts opened her eyes. "Let Pat do that for me, please. Let Pat do everything for me now." The nurse hesitated. Then someone else, Dr. Bentley, came up. "There is no use in giving any more hypodermics," he said. "She has ceased to react to them. Let her rest." Pat heard Mrs. Wilcox break into dreadful sobbing, and Mr. Wilcox led her from the room. The doctor went, too. The nurse adjusted the shade of the light. Pat sat movelessly. She would not speak. No word must disturb Bets's rest. Bets must be better if she were resting. Now and then she felt Bets's fingers give a gentle little pressure against her own. Very gently, Pat squeezed back. In a few days she and Bets would be laughing over this. Next summer, when they would be sleeping in their tent in the moonlit secret field, it would be such a joke to recall. "My breath is getting very short," said Bets. She did not speak again. At sunrise a little change came over her face. Such a little terrible change. "Bets!" cried Pat imploringly. Bets had always answered when she called before. Now she did not even lift the heavy white lids of her beautiful eyes, but she was smiling. "It's over," said the nurse softly. Pat heard someone, Bets's mother, give a piteous moan. She went over to the window and looked out. The sky in the east was splendid. Below, in the valley, the silver birches seemed to float in morning mists. Far off, the harbor lighthouse stood up, golden white against the sunrise. Smoke was curling up from the roofs of Swallow Field and Silver Bush. Pat wished sickly that she could get back into last year. There were no nightmares there. The room was so dreadfully still after all the agony. Pat wished someone would make a noise. Why was the nurse tiptoeing about like that? Nothing could disturb Bets now. Bets who was lying there with the dawn of some eternal day on her face. Pat went over and looked at her quite calmly. Bets looked like someone with a lovely secret. Bets had always looked like that. Only now one knew she would never tell it. Pat dimly recalled some text she had heard ages ago, last Sunday in the Bayshore church. "I am come into deep waters where the floods overflow me." If only one could wake. "I think if I could cry, my throat wouldn't ache so much," she thought dully. Part 2. Home. Mother's silent hand clasp of sympathy. Winnie's kind blue eyes. Judy's anxious. "Patsy Darlant, you've had no breakfast. Can't you be atin' a little bite? You must be keeping up your strength. Don't grieve me, Jewel. Sure, and they tell me she died smiling. She's gone on a glad journey." Pat was not grieving. Death was still incredible. Her family wondered at her calm. "There's something in her isn't believing it yet," said Judy shrewdly. The days were still a dream. There was the funeral. Pat walked calmly up to the long house by the hill path. She would not have been surprised to see Bets coming dancing through the green gate to meet her. She glanced up at the window that used to frame Bets's laughing face. Surely she must be there. The long house was full of people. May Binney was there. May Binney was crying. May Binney, who had always hated Bets, and her mother was trying to comfort her. That was funny. If only Bets could share in her amusement over it. But Bets only lay smiling with that white, sweet peace on her waxen face, and Hilary's cluster of pussy willows from the tree in happiness between her fingers. There were flowers everywhere. The Sunday school had sent a cross with the motto, "Gone Home," on it. Pat would have laughed at that. Only she knew she was never going to laugh again. Home. This was Bets's home. The long house, and the garden she had loved and planned for. Bets was not gone home. She had only gone on an unaccompanied journey from which she must presently return. May Binney almost had hysterics when the casket was closed. Many people thought Pat Gardner was very unfeeling. Only a discerning few, though, that fierce, rebellious young face more piteous than many tears. If only she could get by herself, somewhere where people could not look at her. But if one persisted in dreaming, one must go to the graveyard. She went with Uncle Tom, because Sid and Hilary, who were pall-bearers, had taken the car. Spring still refused to come, and it was a bleak, dull day. A few snowflakes were falling on the gray fields. The sea was black and grim. The cold road was hard as iron. And so they came to the little burying ground on a western hill that had been flooded with many hundreds of sunsets, where there was a heap of red clay and an empty grave. The boys Betts had played around with carried her to it over a path heaped with the sodden leaves of a vanished year, and Pat listened unflinchingly to the most dreadful sound in the world, the sound of clots falling on the coffin of the beloved. "She is in a better place, my dear," Mrs. Binney was saying to the sobbing May behind her. Pat turned. "Do you think there is a better place than Silverbush and the Long House farm?" she said. "I don't, and I don't think Betts did either." "That awful girl," Mrs. Binney always said when she told of it. "She talked like a perfect heathen." Pat wakened from her dream that evening. The sun set. Then came darkness, and the hills and trees drawing nearer. No light in Betts's window. Pat had never really believed that anyone she loved could die. Now she had learned the bitter lesson that it is possible, that it does happen. "Let me be alone tonight, Winnie," she said, and Winnie sympathetically went away to the poet's room. Pat undressed and crept into bed, shivering. The wind at the window was no longer a friend. It was a malignant thing. She was so lonely. It was impossible to endure such loneliness. If she could only sleep, sleep. But then there would be such a dreadful awakening and remembering. Betts was dead. She who loved everything beautiful was now lying in that cold, damp grave on the hill with the long grasses and withered leaves blowing drearily around it. Pat buried her face in her pillow, and the long-denied tears came in a flood. "Darlin', darlin', don't be mournin' like this." Judy had crept in. Dear, tender old Judy. She was kneeling by the bed, and her arms were around the tortured creature. "Oh, Judy, I didn't know life could ever hurt like this. I can't bear it, Judy." "Dear heart, we do all be thinking that at first." "I can never forgive God for taking her from me," gasped Pat between her racking sobs. "Child dear, who ever heard of not forgiving God?" said the horrified Judy, who did not know her Omar. "But he won't be holding it against ye. Life has all gone to pieces, Judy, and yet I have to go on living. How can I?" "Sure, and you've only got to live one day at a time, darling. One can always be living just one more day." She was such a dear, Judy. We had so many plans. I can't go to Queen's without her. Oh, Judy, our friendship was so beautiful. Why didn't God let it go on? Doesn't He like beautiful things? "Sure, and we can't be telling what He has in mind, but we can be believing it's nothing but good. Maybe He was wanting to keep your friendship beautiful, Patsy darling."